The night was alive with laughter inside Richard Beaumont's villa, a mansion built to impress and intimidate at the same time. Guests in designer suits and shimmering dresses raised crystal glasses as the millionaire's booming voice echoed across the marble hall. Richard loved nothing more than being the center of attention, his jokes loud, his presence overwhelming. But tonight, his eyes had found a new target. The quiet Nanny who stood at the edge of the room, watching over his daughter. She didn't belong to this world of excess, and perhaps that was exactly why Richard felt the urge to pull her into the spotlight just to see how she would squirm. He turned with a grin that carried both charm and cruelty, pointing at Anna Müller. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard announced, his voice theatrical, "our nanny here speaks German. Why don't you give us a little show, Anna? Entertain us in your native tongue." The guests laughed immediately, eager to join his game, their faces glowing with the thrill of seeing someone cornered. Anna froze for a brief second, her hand resting gently on Clara's shoulder, the little girl looking up at her with innocent, questioning eyes. The room expected a shy laugh, maybe a clumsy attempt, something that would keep Richard's dominance intact. But Anna didn't play along. She slowly lifted her gaze toward Richard, her eyes calm yet unshakably steady. There was no trace of embarrassment, no sign of submission. Instead, her silence cut through the crowd's laughter like a knife. Some of the guests shifted uncomfortably, sensing a tension they couldn't name. Richard, however, pressed on, enjoying the discomfort he was forcing upon her. "Come on, don't be shy," he insisted, his grin widening. "Say something in German. Anything. We want to hear the sound of it. Make us laugh." He expected her to fold under the pressure, as so many had done before. Anna finally opened her mouth, but instead of offering a playful phrase, she spoke words none of them recognized. Her voice was low, steady, and deliberate, each syllable sharp enough to slice through the chatter. The German flowed out strong and uncompromising, and though not a single person in the room could understand her, the tone alone was enough to alter the atmosphere completely. Laughter ceased. Glasses lowered. The air grew heavy. Even Clara stared at her nanny with wide eyes, sensing something important had just been spoken. Richard blinked, momentarily robbed of his usual confidence. He glanced around, waiting for someone to break the tension, to chuckle, to pretend it was still a joke. But no one moved. His guests, who had seconds earlier been so eager to laugh, now sat frozen in confusion. There was no punchline here, no silly accent, no stumble to mock. Instead, there was only Anna's unwavering voice, speaking with a conviction that made people feel as if they were intruding on something sacred. The silence that followed was unlike anything Richard had ever experienced at his own parties. Trying to mask his unease, Richard forced a laugh, louder and more exaggerated than before. "Well," he said, his voice cracking slightly, "I suppose that's one way to say it." A few guests chuckled nervously, desperate to return to the safety of laughter, but their eyes betrayed the truth. They were unsettled. Anna gave no explanation, no smile, no apology. She simply turned back to Clara, whispering something soft to the girl in English, as though the entire incident had not happened at all. The contrast between her unshakable composure and Richard's forced bravado made the imbalance of power quietly shift in the room. Whispers began to spread among the guests, subtle and cautious. "What did she say?" one woman murmured to another, her voice barely audible. A man who had studied abroad in Europe frowned, trying to recall if he had caught any familiar word. But the way Anna had delivered them, it was more than language. It felt like a command, a declaration, something that demanded respect. The wealthy crowd, accustomed to feeling superior, suddenly found themselves disoriented by a simple sentence they couldn't comprehend. The laughter that had once filled the villa was gone, replaced by curiosity laced with unease. And at the center of it all stood Anna Müller, unbothered, her calm presence more powerful than any performance Richard could have orchestrated. In that silence, she had taken control of the room, without raising her voice, without lifting her hands, without seeking attention. Richard, for the first time, realized he had underestimated her. He didn't know what she had said, and maybe that ignorance was the very thing that left him shaken. Mystery wrapped itself around the moment like a shroud, leaving everyone in the villa with the same haunting question. What exactly had the nanny just spoken into the air? The murmurs began softly, like the faint rustling of leaves in a quiet forest. Guests leaned toward one another, their polished smiles masking unease as they whispered questions that no one could answer. The glow of chandeliers felt too bright, almost accusatory, as Richard Beaumont stood at the center of his own party, suddenly aware that the laughter he had orchestrated minutes earlier had evaporated. His cheeks burned, though he disguised it with a smirk, swirling the wine in his glass as if he were still in command of the room. But deep inside, something shifted. Anna, however, appeared untouched by the tension. She knelt beside Clara, gently tucking a loose strand of hair behind the little girl's ear, her face serene, as though the entire episode had been nothing more than a passing breeze. Clara looked at her with eyes that sparkled with quiet admiration, the kind that children reserve for people they feel safe with. The girl giggled softly at something Anna whispered, a sound so innocent it cut sharply against the strained silence of the hall. To everyone else, Anna seemed invisible again, absorbed in her role, but her presence weighed heavier than ever. Richard tried to dismiss the discomfort with exaggerated gestures, patting his guests on the back and forcing chuckles out of them. "Just a bit of fun, nothing more," he assured, his voice carrying that same theatrical tone he used in business negotiations. Yet, when his gaze fell on Anna, still calmly interacting with Clara, his chest tightened. There was no defiance in her face, but the steadiness of her eyes unsettled him more than open rebellion would have. It was as if she knew something he didn't, as if she carried a truth too big to be ridiculed. The guests, sensing his falter, exchanged uneasy glances. Conversations splintered into fragments, but none regained the carefree flow of before. A man near the piano attempted a joke, yet his voice fell flat, drowned out by the lingering weight of Anna's unknown words. Richard noticed the shift like a storm cloud overhead, invisible yet suffocating. He straightened his posture, trying to restore control by projecting confidence. Still, the memory of her German syllables replayed in his mind, hauntingly sharp, each one slicing into his ego like a blade. Anna rose gracefully, guiding Clara toward the dining table where a plate of untouched dessert waited. The girl tugged at her hand, whispering something inaudible, and Anna's smile softened. Not once did she acknowledge the room, the whispers, or Richard's watchful eyes. Her indifference was her greatest weapon, and though subtle, it made the millionaire feel smaller than he had in years. He had built an empire, commanded hundreds of employees, crushed rivals with ease. But here, a single nanny had shaken his authority without even trying. Richard raised his glass again, this time drinking deeper than intended. He laughed louder, trying to drown the silence with his own voice, but his guests weren't fooled. Their curiosity clung to Anna, drawn to the enigma she represented. Why had her tone sounded so commanding? Why had it stripped the laughter from the room in an instant? The question spread like an invisible fire, igniting speculation that refused to die down. Richard could feel it building, the possibility that his joke had unveiled something far beyond his control. For Clara, though, there was no mystery. She clung to Anna's hand with the ease of a child who trusted unconditionally. Her shy nature, usually withdrawn in the chaos of her father's social gatherings, blossomed in the nanny's company. Anna's presence gave her a sense of safety she had never found in Richard's world of grandeur. It was this bond, quiet and unspoken, that unsettled Richard the most. His daughter's trust was slipping away, not into danger, but into the arms of someone whose strength he could neither measure nor dismiss. The night pressed forward, but the mood never fully recovered. Laughter returned in patches, yet it lacked sincerity, each chuckle wrapped in hesitation. Richard felt the eyes of his guests on him, questioning, weighing, perhaps even judging. And at the heart of it all was Anna, moving silently through the room like a shadow, her past a locked door behind her calm expression. Richard didn't know what secrets she carried, but he knew one thing with certainty. Whatever they were, they had the power to strip him bare in front of his own world. Clara had always been a quiet child, retreating into herself when surrounded by the overwhelming voices of adults who spoke over her, never to her. In her father's grand home, filled with echoes of power and wealth, her small presence often went unnoticed. But with Anna, things were different. The nanny knelt to her level, spoke gently, and looked her in the eye as if her words mattered. At first, Clara answered with hesitant nods, shy smiles that faded quickly. Yet Anna's patience was unwavering, and slowly, the little girl began to let her guard down. Their bond deepened in the simplest of ways, through language. Anna introduced Clara to German, not with long lectures, but with playful phrases woven into their daily routine. She taught her how to say good morning and thank you, encouraging her to repeat the words with pride. Clara's tongue stumbled at first, her voice timid, but Anna never mocked or corrected harshly. Instead, she praised each attempt, turning mistakes into stepping stones. Clara began to feel the joy of learning, not as a burden, but as a discovery she shared with someone who believed in her. It wasn't just vocabulary that Anna imparted. With each phrase, she taught Clara values disguised as lessons. When we say thank you, we look into someone's eyes, Anna explained gently. It shows respect. Clara, who had been accustomed to the cold, transactional exchanges of her father's world, began to understand warmth and sincerity through these small practices. She learned that words carried weight, not just in meaning but in intention. Slowly, the child who once hid in corners started stepping forward with a quiet but growing confidence. Richard observed the changes with a mixture of confusion and unease. Clara, who had once clung to silence, now asked questions at the dinner table. She expressed curiosity about places she had never seen, about people she had never met. Her laughter rang clearer, her posture straighter, as though an invisible burden had been lifted. Richard had long believed his wealth could provide everything his daughter needed, yet here was Anna, accomplishing in weeks what he had failed to do for years. It unsettled him, though he could not deny the transformation before his eyes. One evening, Clara proudly repeated a German phrase in front of her father. "Mut macht stark," she said, her little voice brimming with certainty. Richard frowned, uncomprehending, but Anna translated softly, "Courage makes you strong." The words struck deeper than he expected, echoing like an accusation. Clara's eyes shone with pride, looking not at him, but at Anna for approval. For the first time, Richard felt displaced in his own home, realizing that his daughter's admiration was shifting toward the woman he had once tried to ridicule. Anna, however, never sought to undermine Richard. Her focus remained entirely on Clara, nurturing the child with gentle consistency. She celebrated small victories. Clara's willingness to read aloud, her courage to greet guests, her newfound habit of speaking her mind. Each moment strengthened their connection, one built not on authority or fear, but on trust and encouragement. Anna's quiet presence became the safe harbor Clara had been missing all along, a harbor that money could never construct. To Clara, Anna was more than a nanny. She was a guide, a teacher, perhaps even a role model. The other staff noticed the change as well. Clara, once distant and hesitant, now approached them with politeness and confidence. She practiced her German greetings on the chef, giggled with the maid as she tried new words, and even corrected herself with determination when mistakes slipped through. The household, accustomed to Richard's cold demeanor, began to feel the ripple effect of Anna's influence. For the first time in years, the house carried not only wealth, but warmth, though Richard refused to acknowledge it aloud. In the quiet of her room, Clara often asked Anna for bedtime stories, not of fairy tales, but of real places and people. Anna told her about forests in Germany, about discipline and kindness, about strength that came not from dominance, but from resilience. Clara listened intently, her eyes wide, absorbing every lesson. These stories shaped her in ways Richard could not yet see, planting seeds of independence and courage. And while Anna never revealed the full extent of her past, her guidance hinted at depths far beyond her role. She was no simple nanny, she was something greater. Later that night, when the clinking of glasses had quieted and most of the guests had left, Richard lingered in the great hall with a few stragglers. Among them was a diplomat's son, a man well-traveled and fluent in several languages. He approached Richard discreetly, his voice low enough not to carry. "Those words she spoke," he murmured. "They weren't conversational German. They were structured, precise, commands, military ones." Richard laughed it off in front of him, brushing the comment aside with his usual arrogance. But inside his chest, a knot tightened. Military commands, from a nanny. The thought gnawed at him long after the man departed. Alone in his study, Richard poured himself another drink, the amber liquid trembling in the crystal glass as his mind replayed the moment. He had forced her into the spotlight to embarrass her, to amuse his guests. Yet instead, she had seized control of the room with nothing but a few foreign words. Now, if this revelation were true, her choice of language had not been accidental. It was deliberate, intentional. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, staring at the shadows stretching across the high ceiling, and for the first time he questioned who he had truly invited into his home. His instincts urged him to dig deeper. Pulling his laptop closer, Richard began searching for traces of Anna Müller online. At first, the results were ordinary. Common names, scattered profiles that didn't match her face. But then he noticed how little there was to find, how neatly absent she seemed from the digital world. No photographs, no public records worth noting, no past employers flaunting recommendations. It was as though she had walked out of nowhere into his villa. Richard, a man who prided himself on controlling information and people alike, found this absence unsettling. He clenched his jaw, determined to uncover what she was hiding. As the night stretched into silence, Richard's mind refused to rest. He replayed her calm gaze, the steadiness with which she had stared him down, the way she had spoken with conviction that commanded silence. No nanny he had ever hired carried themselves that way. Something about her belonged to another life, one of discipline, perhaps even danger. Yet she blended into his household with effortless grace, her bond with Clara deepening as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Richard closed his laptop with a snap, the unanswered questions echoing in the emptiness of his study. Who was Anna Müller really? One afternoon, when the villa was quieter than usual and Clara was away at a piano lesson, Richard wandered into the wing where Anna stayed. He told himself it was his right, this was his house, and nothing inside its walls should be hidden from him. Still, his steps felt heavier than normal, his heart thudding with a rhythm he couldn't ignore. In Anna's modest room, he searched with the precision of a man used to controlling every detail. At first, he found nothing more than folded clothes and a neatly stacked set of children's books. But in the drawer of a wooden desk, tucked beneath plain papers, lay a slim folder bound with string worn with age. Richard pulled it open with cautious hands, expecting perhaps certificates or a resume. What he found instead caught him off guard. Old photographs of a man in a professor's coat, surrounded by students, his eyes sharp with intellect. Alongside them, yellowed documents stamped with emblems of German institutions, faded letters referencing resistance and operation. His fingers tightened around the pages as he realized this man was Anna's father, a professor who had lived a double life during the Cold War, teaching by day and resisting by night. The thought unsettled him. Anna's bloodline carried secrets of discipline and defiance. Deeper in the folder were documents with Anna's own name, certificates in linguistics, fluency across multiple languages, German, English, French, Russian. Notes of her work as a translator, but not in ordinary contexts. The letters described her presence at diplomatic meetings, her silence valued as much as her skill, her discretion praised in handwritten testimonials from officials whose names Richard recognized. She had lived in the shadows of history, it seemed, never claiming attention, but playing roles far greater than her quiet presence now suggested. It struck him how little she had revealed, how deliberately she had hidden this life. Richard sat down heavily in her chair, staring at the documents spread before him. The arrogance that usually fueled him wavered as he considered the depth of what he had uncovered. Anna was not merely a nanny. She was someone who had chosen invisibility after walking corridors of power. Why here, why now in his home with his daughter? The question unsettled him even more than the answers he had just found. He felt a strange mixture of respect and fear, as though he had stumbled upon a weapon disguised as a quiet woman. Closing the folder carefully, Richard's mind swirled with conflicting impulses. Part of him wanted to confront her immediately, to expose what he had found and demand an explanation. Another part held back, knowing instinctively that if Anna had kept this past buried, she must have had good reason. To reveal his discovery now might shift the balance of power too openly, and Richard hated the thought of being vulnerable. Instead, he resolved to keep the knowledge to himself for the time being. He would observe her, test her, and wait for the right moment. When Anna returned later that evening, nothing in Richard's demeanor betrayed his intrusion. He greeted her with the same commanding tone, masking the storm within him. But as he watched her guide Clara gently upstairs, he noticed every movement differently now. Her posture, her deliberate choice of words, even the way she listened, he saw in them traces of discipline he had once dismissed. The nanny he thought he could mock so easily had lived a life that eclipsed his own in ways he could hardly comprehend. That realization stung him more than he expected. The days that followed became a silent game. Richard watched her interactions with renewed scrutiny, dropping small remarks to test her reactions. He would casually mention Germany in conversation, or refer to historical events with loaded pauses. Anna never flinched, never gave herself away. Her calm eyes seemed to say she had nothing to prove, and that quiet strength unnerved him. Clara, meanwhile, flourished under her guidance, unaware of the hidden tension building in the household. The bond between nanny and child only deepened, further amplifying Richard's unease. At night, when the house grew silent and his guests had gone, Richard found himself staring at the closed folder he had hidden in his study drawer. He had all the evidence of her extraordinary past, yet it brought him no comfort, only questions. Why would a woman with such history choose to become a nanny in his home? Was it chance or something more deliberate? The mystery hung over him like a shadow he couldn't shake. One thing was certain, he could no longer see Anna Müller as ordinary, and the uncertainty of what she might reveal unsettled him more than he dared admit. Richard had carefully orchestrated the evening, inviting guests who prided themselves on their sophistication. Among the laughter and clinking glasses, he once again saw an opportunity to reduce Anna to a spectacle. With a half smile, he raised his voice so all could hear. "Anna, why don't you translate for us?" His tone dripped with mockery, as though he expected her to falter, to stumble before the crowd and confirm the image he had painted of her, a modest nanny who belonged only in the background, never in the spotlight. Anna's fingers tightened briefly around her glass, but her expression remained serene. She stepped forward with quiet confidence, her presence commanding without arrogance. She began to speak, first in English with a fluency that carried elegance, then shifting seamlessly into German, her words precise and crisp, echoing with authority. Before anyone could fully process, she transitioned into French, her voice warm yet sharp, every syllable resonating with mastery. The room, once alive with chatter, fell completely silent. Richard's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized this was no performance of hesitation. Anna stood like someone who had always belonged in circles of intellect and power. Each sentence she delivered in the different tongues carried not only fluency, but also depth, as if she were weaving threads of history, culture and meaning into the room itself. Guests leaned closer, captivated, as though they were witnessing something sacred and extraordinary unfold before them. When she finally paused, Anna looked directly at Richard. There was no malice in her eyes, no hint of revenge, only calm defiance. The strength of someone who had endured humiliation yet refused to be broken. The silence stretched heavy in the air, suffocating in its intensity. Guests shifted uncomfortably, waiting for Richard to laugh it off, to somehow reclaim control. But nothing came. His ignorance had been laid bare, and no clever remark could erase it. One of the guests, a seasoned diplomat, whispered almost reverently, "Impeccable." Another nodded in agreement, astonished at her composure and skill. For years, these gatherings had been Richard's stage, his arena to display superiority. Tonight, however, the stage had been claimed by someone who had never asked for it. Anna hadn't insulted him, hadn't mocked him back. She had simply revealed the truth of who she was. That revelation alone had dismantled Richard's carefully curated image. The weight of her silence after speaking pressed harder than any insult could have. Guests began murmuring among themselves, words like brilliant, unexpected, and extraordinary circling the room. Richard, however, felt the ground slipping beneath him. Every glance that turned toward Anna instead of him was another crack in his dominance. His hand trembled slightly as he raised his glass, forcing a smile that convinced no one. He had underestimated her gravely, and now everyone knew it. Anna did not bask in the admiration. Instead, she lowered her gaze slightly, returning to her quiet stance, as though nothing remarkable had happened. This perhaps was the most unsettling part for Richard and the others, her humility after such a display of brilliance. It was clear she had not performed for applause, but had simply answered his challenge in the only way she knew how, with truth, precision, and dignity. The power of restraint made her victory even sharper. The evening lingered in an uneasy hush, the balance of power permanently altered. Guests avoided eye contact with Richard, afraid of being pulled into his humiliation. Instead, their eyes returned again and again to Anna, who had redefined herself not through titles or wealth, but through undeniable skill and presence. Richard felt exposed, smaller than he had ever been in his own home, and for the first time, he understood that the nanny he had mocked was not someone he could control. She was someone he would never truly match. Richard sat alone in his study, the heavy curtains shutting out the night. His reflection in the glass of his whiskey trembled as he lifted the glass to his lips, but it wasn't the liquor that unsettled him. It was the memory of Anna's calm, commanding voice, silencing an entire room. For years, he had defined himself through power, wealth, and superiority, yet in one evening, a woman he dismissed as a mere nanny had unraveled his carefully constructed image. The humiliation gnawed at him, and for the first time, Richard wondered if his arrogance had not only alienated him from others, but from himself. The house felt colder without the distraction of applause and admiration. He replayed the looks on the guests' faces, their awe not directed at him, but at Anna. Their silence had been more cutting than any insult. He thought about Clara's smile whenever Anna was near, bright, genuine, free of fear. His daughter had never looked at him with such warmth. That realization ached like a wound he could not bandage. Beneath his pride, Richard began to recognize that the battle he thought he had with Anna was not truly against her, but against the reflection of his own inadequacies. Clara's words lingered like an echo in his mind. "She's the only one who listens to me." He had dismissed them when she first spoke them, assuming it was childish exaggeration. But now, in the silence of the study, those words burned. How many times had Clara tried to reach him, only to find him distracted, preoccupied with meetings, investments, and appearances? He had prided himself on giving her everything money could buy, yet Anna had given her something far more valuable: attention, presence, and understanding. It was a currency he had never considered, but suddenly he saw how bankrupt he was in his daughter's eyes. His arrogance had been a fortress, protecting him from criticism, but isolating him from love. Anna had not stormed that fortress with force. She had simply stood as herself, unapologetic, steady, authentic, And in doing so, she had shown him the cracks he had refused to see. Richard found himself replaying not only her words, but her silence, the way she could look at him without flinching, without lowering her gaze, as though she saw something in him that even he could not. It unsettled him, but beneath that discomfort was a flicker of something unfamiliar: respect. Pacing the study, Richard wrestled with questions he had long buried. Had he mistaken dominance for strength? Was his wealth a shield against the emptiness he carried inside? The more he thought of Anna, the more he realized she embodied qualities he had never valued: humility, patience, empathy. These were traits he had once considered weak, yet in her they appeared powerful, undeniable. If she could win the loyalty of his daughter without force, perhaps it was because she possessed something he had lost long ago. The thought unsettled him because it demanded he look inward, and self-reflection was the one territory he had never dared to enter. For the first time in years, Richard's mind was not on his business empire, his rivals, or his next acquisition. Instead, it circled around Anna and Clara. He saw Clara's laughter as she leaned against Anna's shoulder, the ease in her voice, the glow of feeling understood. It was a bond money could not manufacture. He realized, with shame, that he had tried to buy Clara's love, when what she needed was his presence. Anna had given her that effortlessly. The mirror before him grew harsher, a father absent in spirit even when he was physically there. In the stillness of the night, Richard's defenses crumbled further. He thought back to his late wife, to the promises he had made as a young man to always put family first. Somewhere along the way, those promises had been replaced by ambition and pride. His success had cost him more than he admitted, and Anna's presence had brought that truth crashing to the surface. She wasn't a servant placed in his home to obey orders. She was a living reminder of the man he could have been, had he not drowned himself in arrogance. The realization was brutal, but necessary. As the clock ticked past midnight, Richard remained in his chair, drained yet restless. Humiliation had been his first response, but now reflection pressed deeper. Anna had become more than a challenge to his pride. She was a mirror, showing him his flaws with quiet precision. And in that reflection, Richard saw not just what he had lost, but what he might still reclaim if he had the courage to face himself. The path forward was unclear, but one truth was undeniable. Anna had changed something within him. Whether he liked it or not, the man who had walked into that party was not the same man sitting alone tonight. Richard found himself restless that evening, pacing his study with a glass of untouched whiskey on the desk. He had called Anna privately, yet he didn't fully understand why. For a man who had always demanded answers and control, the silence between them was unsettling. When she entered, her posture calm and unshaken, he suddenly felt like the intruder in his own home. The weight of his pride pressed against him, making it harder to speak the words he had never spoken to anyone. Words of remorse, of vulnerability, of doubt. He cleared his throat, unable to look directly into her eyes. Instead of offering the apology that lingered on his tongue but refused to surface, he asked the question that haunted him. "Why did you stay even after everything I did?" His voice was sharper than intended, but beneath it was a tremor of fear of hearing the truth he had long avoided. The room, once a fortress of his authority, now felt fragile, its walls closing in on the silence that followed. Anna did not flinch. Her gaze remained steady, almost compassionate, yet it carried a quiet firmness that stripped away his defenses. "Because Clara needs strength, not money," she replied, her tone calm, deliberate. "And sometimes silence speaks louder than arrogance." The simplicity of her words cut through layers of his pride, reaching the very core of the man who had built his empire on control, only to realize he was powerless in the matters of the heart. Richard felt the ground beneath him shift. The answer he had received was not one of submission, but of clarity. Anna had never been there because of him, nor because of the wealth that surrounded them. She had stayed because of Clara, because of a truth deeper than comfort or luxury. For the first time, he felt stripped bare, exposed not by an enemy or a rival, but by the quiet resilience of someone he had underestimated. He was speechless. His usual words of power dissolved into silence. Anna did not linger in the study after her response. She bowed her head slightly, not out of servitude, but as a gesture of closure, and walked toward the door. Richard wanted to call her back, to find the courage to say the apology that still burned on his lips, but his voice betrayed him. He sat in his chair, the sound of her footsteps fading into the corridor, leaving him alone with the bitter taste of regret. His wealth, his name, his influence, all seemed powerless in that moment. Later, Richard wandered to the window overlooking the garden. There, beneath the fading light of dusk, he saw Anna walking beside Clara. Their steps were slow, deliberate, filled with an unspoken harmony that no money could manufacture. Clara's laughter floated up toward him, light and free, while Anna's calm presence anchored it. For Richard, it was a vision that struck deeper than any business triumph. His daughter's happiness bloomed in the company of the very woman he had once dismissed. He pressed his hand against the glass, realizing the cruel irony. What he had tried to buy with fortune, Anna had given freely through patience and love. She had become the strength Clara leaned on, the voice of balance he himself had failed to be. Watching them together, Richard felt small, not in the sense of humiliation, but in recognition of a truth greater than his empire. For the first time, silence became unbearable, for silence was filled with the echo of what he had lost. As Anna and Clara reached the roses in the garden, Clara turned to her with a look of admiration so pure it pierced Richard's heart. Anna, without speaking, guided her gently, pointing at the blossoms, teaching her the language of growth without uttering a word. The scene was almost sacred, untouched by the weight of fortune or authority. Richard felt like an outsider, a man who owned the land yet did not belong to the moment unfolding within it. The night drew in, and still Richard remained at the window. Anna's quiet dignity seemed more powerful than all the wealth stacked in his vaults. Her silence had spoken volumes about resilience, about love, about truths that could not be bought. As Clara held Anna's hand, Richard finally understood that legacy was not written in contracts or fortunes, but in the bonds we leave behind. He could not command awe anymore. Instead, he was left in silence, humbled by the strength he had once mistaken for weakness. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the study where Richard sat alone. The events of the previous evening replayed in his mind, each detail sharper than the last. He realized that his world, once defined by wealth and power, felt emptier without understanding the people who mattered most. Anna's quiet authority lingered in the air, a reminder that influence wasn't measured in banknotes, but in the strength to act with integrity, patience, and insight. Clara entered, her eyes bright and her smile unburdened by yesterday's tensions. She ran to Richard, who instinctively reached for her, feeling both pride and shame in equal measure. Her laughter, innocent and genuine, was a balm to his wounded ego. But the memory of Anna guiding her through the garden weighed heavily on him. He realized that Clara's admiration for Anna was deeper, earned not through gifts or commands, but through respect and trust. Richard tried to speak, to bridge the invisible distance that had grown between him and the people he loved. Yet words failed him. He wanted to express his gratitude, his apology, his new awareness of what truly mattered, but the language of humility was foreign. Watching Anna and Clara together, he felt both powerless and enlightened, forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that authority without empathy was empty. He left the study and wandered into the garden, hesitating before stepping onto the stone path where Anna and Clara moved like a living portrait. Anna noticed him, but did not pause. Her gaze was steady, neither forgiving nor scolding, simply present. Richard realized that respect could not be demanded. It had to be earned through consistent honesty and care. For the first time, he saw Anna not as an employee or a challenge, but as a teacher, one whose lessons were quietly reshaping his understanding of family, power, and love. As he approached, Clara turned to him and tugged gently at his hand, inviting him into their shared world. Anna observed, her expression calm, almost imperceptibly approving. Richard's heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and remorse. He understood that his previous arrogance had built walls, and only by dismantling them with patience and sincerity could he hope to reconnect. The realization that wealth alone could never repair emotional distance struck him with unexpected clarity. They walked together among the roses, the scents mingling with the soft rustle of leaves. Richard noticed details he had overlooked for years. The way Clara's laughter harmonized with Anna's quiet guidance, the careful attention Anna gave to every word and gesture. These were moments impossible to buy, lessons impossible to command. And yet, here they were, freely offered, teaching him a new form of power, one rooted in humility, care, and understanding. Richard paused near a marble bench, reflecting on the subtle strength Anna carried. Her influence was unspoken but undeniable, shaping the people around her without confrontation or ostentation. He finally understood that real leadership required more than dominance. It demanded patience, compassion, and courage to stand firm in silence. For the first time, he considered that perhaps his daughter's happiness and growth were far more important than his own pride or reputation. Anna caught his gaze and offered a small, neutral nod, acknowledging his presence without diminishing her own authority. Richard felt a strange relief in that gesture, recognizing it as both acceptance and challenge. He did not need to claim control, for the moment had already passed beyond his reach, leaving him only with awareness. That awareness was a gift, difficult but invaluable, a chance to rebuild bonds he had ignored for far too long. As the sun climbed higher, Richard felt the weight of his fortune shift in his mind, replaced by something more enduring. He no longer sought to command awe or fear. He sought understanding and connection. Observing Anna and Clara together, he realized that wealth could not create loyalty, love, or respect, but humility and patience could nurture them. And in that garden, surrounded by quiet dignity and unspoken power, Richard glimpsed a new path, one defined not by what he owned, but by the relationships he chose to honor and protect.